Alright guys, so in this video we're going to be talking about Unit 1, Exploration and Colonization. And so in your formula chart that you just made, you will be going here, Unit 1, and this is where you're going to jot down 3, 4, maybe 5 things that strike you as very interesting about this unit. So again, fill in this box here with as much information as you can. Remember, there are no overachievers. So let's get into it. In the late 1500s, Europe was going through a transition from the medieval times to the Renaissance period. And the Renaissance was the time where Europeans took a significant interest in things like science, exploration, reasoning. You get a lot of arts coming out during the Renaissance period, especially in Italy and around the Mediterranean. So there's a lot going on in Europe. People are curious. People want to get out. Kingdoms want to make money. They want to expand. So here we go. Here's kind of what it looked like at that point in time, and you can see some very familiar names: Spain, France, England, Scotland. But then there's other ones out there that just don't exist anymore, and that's an ongoing trend that we'll see throughout history, and especially when you get into 10th grade into world history. So it's what it looked like in the 1400s, and all of these European explorers, man, they were setting out and they were going over land, and they were trying to find water routes because navigation was becoming very popular. Like really good navigation was becoming popular and becoming something that they could perfect. So people knew how to get around in boats. So here we have a map of the world, and you can see the different explorers, and they got out and voyaged. And there was one in particular. Christopher Columbus set off in 1493. They say 1492, and on this map it says 1493. But what he was trying to do was he was trying to leave from Spain and sail all the way around and actually hit Japan. They didn't know at this time, they didn't really understand that there were two other continents over here across this ocean. So when Christopher Columbus set out, and he hit this land, he thought he was way over here in Japan. Okay, or actually he thought he was in India. He thought he had gone around to India, but he had actually come upon a whole land that the Europeans had, some say, just forgotten about. Others say he discovered, but there were already people living there, and that's really the point. These people were already living there in the Western Hemisphere. So, and he called them Indians because he thought he was in India, and he was like, oh, they look like Indians, so yeah, that's where we get that from, and now we know, and we know the politically correct term is Native Americans. So Christopher Columbus comes in, and he sets up, he sets the precedent for what we call the Columbian Exchange, which is just the exchange of information, ideas, goods, products from one side of the Atlantic Ocean to the other, and it goes back and forth. All right, and it also sets up a bunch of other countries coming and starting to colonize these two new continents that really were previously unknown until then. So over the next couple of hundred years, different European powers start colonizing places such as South America, North America, and you see Spain in green colonized a huge swath of territory in South America and the southern United States, including Florida. All right, you see the French are kind of there in the central United States, what we currently know as the United States and up in Canada, and what we really need to talk about are the British. But what's happening to these Native Americans, and it should be noted and it should not be forgotten, is that they're forced to do a lot of things against their will. Some of them were forced by Catholics to convert to Christianity or be executed. They were forced to give up their lands. A lot of them were forced into slave labor to dig for things like gold, minerals, to work in the sugar fields and things like that. So it was a pretty nasty business what these Europeans were bringing over. So what we need to talk about is the actual establishment of what we know today as the United States of America, and that starts on the Atlantic coastline with the British setting up shop and making it their own, and we call it the 13 colonies. The 13 British colonies you'll hear, or the American colonies. as some of the English like to say these days. Boom, there's your proverbial bomb being dropped, the American bomb. All right. So this is a map of the original 13 American colonies, and they weren't just set up overnight. It started actually with the Virginia Company, and they started here in what is modern-day North Carolina. That colony was lost, and so they came and started a new colony of Jamestown in Virginia. And here's a drawing of Jamestown. It wasn't successful at first, but it became pretty successful in the tobacco trade, and we'll get there later. Now, we talk about what you know as pilgrims, and what they were actually called at the time was separatists, because they had separated from the Church of England. They had sought to start their own colonies in North America, in English North America, and so they got permission to take all of their separatist friends, get on a boat called the Mayflower, and come over, and they ended up in Massachusetts. So they were trying to go to Virginia. They ended up in Massachusetts, and they settled there. And so we have an issue. There's a huge distance in between England and the American colonies, and it's way too vast for effective communication. It takes roughly 2-ish months in good weather with no hiccups to get from England to North America. All right, so that's another 2 months back. So let's say you have to ask for something from the British government or from your company in Britain. It's going to take 2 months to get there, probably another month to get an answer, and 2 months back. That's 5 months. So, people had to create their own rules, and they had to be able to be self-sufficient, especially when it came to keeping the peace, to just governing their towns. And so they created what we know as the first representative governments in the American colonies. And this picture right here shows the signing of the Mayflower Compact, which was done by the separatists, or what we know as pilgrims, as they were getting off the Mayflower, and it was a compact on how they were going to. It was just a written agreement on how they were going to run their colony and keep the peace. All right, down in Virginia, they had the House of Burgesses, which kind of mirrored Parliament in England. They took representatives from each of the plantations in Virginia and sent them to this big meeting room, and they would hash out laws, and they discuss problems, and they make legislations and things like that. So these are our first representative governments and representative assemblies, and that's very important. You need to know that. So how did they make money? Up in the north, the climate was kind of cold and rocky a lot of the time, so it was really hard to plant crops, but they did have huge forests. So they made money by shipping wood back to Europe. They made money by fishing. They would build ships. They had some big naval yards, a lot of things that they could do. But down in the south, they grew crops, and they could grow tobacco. Cotton becomes huge later on, but indigo was a big thing, blue dye, rice, things like that. So here's the next problem. We need a workforce. Who is actually going to pick these crops in the south? England had the answer, along with a bunch of the other European colonies, because of the exploration and colonization of Africa. They took African slaves and brought them to the Americas. Okay, and it wasn't just England. The Dutch, the French. There was slave trade going on at the early stages between most of the European countries, because they needed that workforce. They needed cheap labor down in their American colonies in both North and South America. So this is what we call the triangular trade, and it's the trade routes between Europe, North America, and Africa. And anytime you see this, you can see the triangle. The rum was sent from Americas along with iron, gunpowder, different things to Africa. Slaves were sent back and shipped up into the colonies, okay? In England, a lot of the raw materials and luxury items like gold and diamonds and things were sent to England, and guns for war chiefs, things like that, were sent back down to Africa. All right, so it was a big crazy thing that was going on, and unfortunately it does define America to this day. So the slaves were treated very harshly. and on their crossing when they were captured, and on their crossings over, and it was just a crazy thing. But England's making a lot of money off the crops and the lumber and all the things in the American colonies, and they adopt this policy to where it's called salutary neglect, where they're like, hey, we don't care what you guys do over there as long as you're making us money. All right, and this goes on for about 150-ish, almost 150 years, until 1754, when everything changes and we start the next unit.